everyone, welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, September 28th, where I wanted to put some closure onto the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and begin our next horror film, which happens to be Dracula. So as you know, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is from the early days of cinema, as many of you responded in the discussion forum questions, that it's definitely a different experience. Watching a silent film requires a lot more attention, even though we did have some text to go along with the film, and that what seems to be perhaps overacting from our perspective would not have been seen as overacting during the early days of cinema. And that the reason why we're starting with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is that it's generally regarded as the first feature-length horror film. And it's definitely viewed as an art film because of its cinematic techniques. And this film was released to some mixed reviews. It premiered in America in 1921. Of course, we're watching a German film, and I think it very much illustrates some of the anxieties of Germany at the time. But as many of you indicated in your discussion forum responses as well, that it also shows some of the more general anxieties that perhaps are universal about what is sanity and what is madness, and how can we trust our own perceptions. So many of you had talked about this film from the psychological perspective, which perhaps is much more frightening than any kind of external monster. But if you're looking forward to external monsters, then definitely the next film, Dracula, will be something that will be of interest to you, though Dracula is oftentimes read from a symbolic perspective that I'll talk about. So at this point, you should have received your journals back from me for the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. As I was indicating, I'm looking for about a page or so response, but as long or as short as it needs to be in order for you to examine the films. And that said, there are lots of different ways that you could go about doing that. My evaluation is informal. I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, instead for content, as if we were having a conversation on paper. And the grading scale, hence, is also informal, with a plus being excellent, and a check plus being very good, and a check being satisfactory. And that's basically where most of the grades usually fall. There also is a check minus, less than unsatisfactory, and a minus, unsatisfactory. And basically, we'll be doing this over the course of the semester for each of the films that we'll be viewing. And certainly, if you need an extension with any of the assignments, let me know, and I'll be happy to grant that to you. But what would be ideal is that within 48 hours of our Thursday class, that you have watched the film and that you have submitted in a journal as well as had your discussion forum response. Now, keep in mind, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. As you can see, I respond to each of you. So, assuming we kept to those deadlines, you could spend the first part of the week basically reading your peers' responses and doing the reading that would be scheduled for that Thursday. And then the Thursday class, as you can see, I post a video where I talk a little bit about the previous film we've seen, and I anticipate the next film that we'll be seeing. And then, of course, the rest is for you to watch the film and then write some commentary about the film. Now, whenever possible, I will provide free links to the films. Certainly, you can find all of these films through streaming services, and the GCC library should have DVD copies of the film. Now, if I am able to find a free link, I may not be able to find a link that has closed captioning. So that said, certainly if you wanted to watch Dracula in another format, it shouldn't be difficult at all for you to be able to find. But I am happy to report that I was able to find a free link on Vimeo for Dracula in the event that you don't have access to it yourself. But basically, we've talked a little bit about expressionistic cinema and that the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari as well as films like Nosferatu, which I will be talking about shortly, are great examples of that, where you've got these surreal and dreamlike images. Part of that, of course, is important for the plot of Caligari and this idea of what would perception be like from the point of view of someone who is insane. And obviously, you can see that everything is distorted, everything is bizarre, everything is shadowy. However, the film is also symbolic as well, as I wanted to talk about, in terms of some of the ways that Caligari and Caesar are read in terms of specifically German history. Film industries at the time were just beginning to relax some of the restrictions on importing German films. Keep in mind that we're coming off of World War One at this point. And that said, I think the artistically experimental element of the film is one of the reasons why it's considered to be an art film, as well as I had indicated, the first horror film. So, the 1920s was a decade, especially for Germany, filled with anxieties because we've got post World War One, and let us not forget that this was also the time of the Spanish flu pandemic. And after us dealing with COVID, I think you can understand some of the fears of a global pandemic. This idea of insanity, how can war be on such a scale that it would be global? And the trauma and death that results from it, not just the war, but the aftermath of the war. Things like disfigurement and mutilation. But we're also talking about the German government and the idea of enforced conformity and mass industrialization and the terrifying reality of where Germany fit into the world order. This sense of who is the enemy is a major question of the German people and also a major question of the film as well. In addition to the question of who is sane and who is insane. And that said, we've got this story frame with the narrator Francis. Originally, at least according to folklore, that story frame was not part of the film. It was only added afterwards because the film was seen to be as too subversive. That Caligari is supposed to represent a repressive German government, controlling and manipulating the masses, as illustrated through a Caesar, and the masses are basically sleepwalking. They are puppets, if you will. So, and that point in the film where we see that Caesar has a double, a doll, a puppet. This idea that the populace is being controlled by the governmental authorities, that the populace is basically a puppet to the will of the government, is one of the more subversive ways that this story can be read. When you've got somebody like Alan asking, how long shall I live? I mean, that was a very important question for Germany. How long would it survive as a nation? And also, how long would German soldiers survive in terms of the war, and German veterans as well? So, this sense of the doppelganger or terrifying double is something that I had suggested you will see in many horror films, including Dracula. The idea that Dracula creates victims much like himself. So he's creating mirror images of himself. A kind of a procreation, if you will. We know that the film has a twist, and the first is that Caligari is supposed to be that mystic. Of course, if you know anything about German history, then you know that this film in some ways kind of prefigures the idea of Hitler, and Hitler, of course, being very interested in mysticism. And perhaps the need for the German populace to need an authoritarian government because of the way that it embraced Hitler. But our second twist is that Francis is insane, hence he's the unreliable narrator. So we can't trust anyone. And I love the idea of the Irish shots that we're getting in the film, because we're supposed to get the eye view of perhaps what Francis would be experiencing. But that said, this idea of also whether or not Caligari is completely innocent is in question. It's possible that both Caligari and Francis are insane. And certainly, we know that that ending statement where Caligari says that he knows exactly how to cure Francis is rather eerie and discomforting, and it's supposed to be. This sense too of madness and sanity, I think, is embedded within the idea of not just the perceptions of the characters and the sets, but this sense of the insane asylum, which again is part of the frame that we're given. Many of you have talked about the psychological horror films such as Shutter Island that utilize this technique, but keep in mind it was Caligari that basically first formulated this technique that's been emulated by horror films since. We also know that in terms of some of the criteria that we've talked about with Gothic and horror film, there's at least the possibility of supernatural. That's important in terms of Caligari acting as mystic or seeming like mystic. Um, Reputedly, the sense that the cabinet is not just reminiscent of a cabinet of curiosities. And I don't know if you've ever heard of a cabinet of curiosities, but reputedly they were quite popular at the time, where ultimately these would be, in effect, carnivalesque episodes and carnivalesque shows that would travel and show all kinds of strange and questionable and perhaps even supernatural elements within a cabinet. But of course, the idea of cabinet can represent subconscious, what's beneath the surface. And that leads to our examining the film from the psychological perspective about fear and anxiety, sanity and insanity. It's no mistake that that cabinet looks like it basically it looks like what we would have with a corpse buried in it, because the idea is that the German populace is perhaps dead in some respects, much like the sleepwalking Caesar, but the coffin-esque idea of that the populace is alive yet also dead at the same time because it's not aware of how it's being manipulated. And I think that those are just a few of the elements that make the cabinet of Dr. Caligari so interesting, especially because of the embedded message within it about mad authority gone awry. But again, that message is diluted with the frame, but that's not to say that it's completely erased with the frame. And I like the idea that there is a sort of sinister element to Caligari, and also perhaps sinister or insane element to Francis at the same time. That this is what war does, and to individuals, is that everyone is impacted in a negative way. But in terms of watching a silent film, as many of you indicated this was your first experience, I encourage you to rewatch The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. As you know, I had suggested 3 viewings, the first purely for plot. And as some of you had suggested that it was a bit difficult to follow the plot. I remember the first time I saw Caligari, and I had some difficulty following the plot as well. Part of that, I think, is because of the silent film genre, which we're really not accustomed to, but the other part are the frames and the embedded narratives as well. The second viewing for analysis, so this would be your coming up with your commentary for, and then your third viewing, ideally, would be before you responded to something like an attendance question or before you responded to something like a journal. But I understand that sometimes time does not permit 3 viewings. But keep in mind that eventually there will be a final exam in this class that I will talk about further. And eventually there will also be a final project in this class that I will talk about further. So even though you've already perhaps submitted in a journal or submitted in your discussion forum response, that doesn't preclude you from rewatching The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari to see if it's something that you might want to devote a final project to, or could be something that would help prepare you for the final exam. The final exam will be an essay exam, and there'll be choice within it. But basically, the final exam is comprehensive. So it will cover all of the films as possibilities. So again, the more familiar you are with the films, then the more comfortable you would probably be talking about the films. But of course, as you know, I've always included commentary to the film through our readings as well as through class videos, and of course your own writing and your own reflections, whether it be through the discussion forum and or it be through the journal. So I wanted to move forward and talk a little bit about Dracula. And the reason why Dracula is our next film is not only because it's from the 1930s, and as you know, I've divided the films up by decade, but it is considered to be the first American horror film. Obviously, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari being the first German horror film. So I had a sign for today from Projected Fears, Chapter 1, which was about Dracula. And in the Nightmares book, Chapter 2, Studio Horrors of the 1930s. The 1930s being such an important time for horror movies, especially the Universal Studio monsters. This is where we get the Frankenstein and the Dracula and the Invisible Man and so forth that have become rather iconic in our society. I also assigned Chapter 10, Reality Bites. Note the pun there. And Chapter 11, Browning, as Todd Browning was the director of Dracula. So just some background information about Dracula, and you can see that this is all included in the notes below my video. The 1930s was a particularly difficult time because of the Great Depression. That's not to say that there weren't political anxieties as well. Fascism, communism, good amount of anti-Semitism, the push for eugenics, and also the beginning of women's votes and the anxieties associated with that. Put all of that together, and film is viewed as escapism. But that's not to say that it's only escapism. As you know, we've talked about all of these films as doing more than just generating profit or offering escapism, that they offer social commentary as well, and particularly examine the anxieties and fears of their time period. So what was happening in the 1930s is that many of the Gothic texts from Europe in the 1800s were being adapted into American films using Gothic sets. Frankenstein is a great example. Even though Frankenstein was written first, because Frankenstein is a novel by Mary Shelley, it was Dracula by Bram Stoker that was first made into a film. Hence, Dracula gets the distinction of being the first American horror film. And Dracula was first adapted to the screen in 1921, however, in Nosferatu, which I have referenced previously. And if you look at the notes below in the second section, under where I'm talking about our readings, you will see that beneath my point about Nosferatu, I have a link that you could click on and you could see a poster for Nosferatu. And it'll probably remind you of something that you saw with Caligari, with the jagged edges and the shadows and so forth. The director of Dracula, Todd Browning, has actually been called the father of American horror film. He believed that most people were morbid. You can agree or disagree with that. Stephen King talks a little bit about this as well in his text Danse Macabre, which I've referenced earlier. He calls it the highway accident syndrome, that the reason why traffic jams occur is because everybody feels compelled to slow down whenever there's an accident on the highway and look, and that as repelled as we are, we're also compelled, so there's a certain morbid fascination with that. So the Library of Congress, U.S. National Film Registry, has listed Dracula as being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. In fact, that's going to be today's attendance question, is that after you view Dracula, and my suspicion is most of you probably are aware of Dracula, but perhaps have not seen the original from the 1930s. But after you viewed it, And again, if you viewed it before, you've got an advantage because with each viewing, you get more detail and nuance. But after you view it, to see if you agree with the Library of Congress National Film Registry that Dracula is indeed culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. Now, Dracula originally had no musical score. Many of you were talking about the score of Nosferatu, or I'm sorry, the score of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Keep in mind that that would have been added in after the fact. Obviously, what we are watching is a video version where there would have been some improvements made to the quality of the film, but also there would have been a musical score that would have been added. That said, if we had watched The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in the 20s in a theater, there would have been a live orchestra that would have been playing to help to provide a soundtrack. Though, of course, those live orchestras didn't necessarily have to all follow the same criteria. So we are not necessarily certain of what a soundtrack would have been like for Caligari. But this particular version, at least the free link that I was able to find, did provide a soundtrack. The version of Dracula that I found does not have the soundtracks, no, or musical score. Of course, it's a talkie, so now we've got dialogue. I think you will see some of the what many people think of as overacting from the silent film era, but much less so than what we saw with Caligari when we watched Dracula. And of course, if I'm finding free links, it may not necessarily be possible for me to get film versions with closed captioning, though of course you can find many of these films, if not all of these films, on streaming services, and you can access them yourself. Now, Todd Browning is also known for another film called Freaks that you may or may not have heard of that came out in 1932. Dracula came out in 1931. It was actually a banned film for many, many years. Because of the internet, you can find it now. And if you look in the notes below, I've actually included a link to a picture from Freaks, and you might understand why it was banned. It's about real circus freaks, and Todd Browning had actually cast real circus freaks, and it was seen to be just a little bit too excessive for audiences at the time, so the film was banned. It's a very interesting film that talks about interior and exterior deformity and what do we value as normal and how do we make those evaluations. But we are focusing on Dracula. The novel Dracula, which I do in my Gothic literature class, by the way, and I encourage you to read, is going to be very different than the film. That's not terribly surprising because texts are oftentimes different from the film. If for no other reason, film usually has about an hour 15 to an hour and a half running time. And if you know anything about the novel Dracula, it's rather lengthy. So there needed to be condensing. And Dracula is also told in something called the epistolary style. So it's told through letters that doesn't translate easily onto film. So they've given us a simplified story. But perhaps the brilliance of Bram Stoker was taking the mythology of Dracul, a cruel Roman emperor, and that means the son of the devil, and using the name Dracula, the son of Dracul, for the vampire. And you probably know him as perhaps Vlad the Impaler from 1400s Romania. Again, if you look at the notes below, you'll see that there are two links. One is a portrait of what we believe Vlad the Impaler looked like, and another is a woodcut. He was known for his barbarity and his torturous nature, where he would impale his enemies, and in the woodcut, he's actually dining with the impaled head surrounding him to show just how vicious he was. Now, the way that Dracula was written is actually kind of interesting, and it relates to Frankenstein. And this is another iconic Gothic text, obviously, Frankenstein. And it's also an iconic horror film. But basically, there was a ghost story competition with Mary Shelley and her husband, Percy Shelley, Percy being the great romantic poet. and some of their companions. They were traveling and they had inclement weather, so they dared themselves to a ghost story competition. And that ghost story competition resulted in one of their friends, Dr. Polidori, writing a short story called The Vampire. And reputedly, The Vampire was in part inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. And out of that ghost story competition, Mary Shelley had a nightmare that night, and it was of the great creation scene that's very iconic to Frankenstein. So that night was the birth of two very gothic texts and two very important texts in the horror tradition. And as I had indicated, the first screen adaptation was Nosferatu, which was a bootleg version, actually, of Dracula. And Dracula was an attempt to try to give a more accurate portrayal of Bram Stoker's vision, even though, again, many liberties were taken. In fact, Bram Stoker's widow had tried to have the film Nosferatu destroyed because it did violate copyright. It was a bootleg version. Luckily, she was unsuccessful because if all of the copies had been destroyed, we wouldn't have this incredibly beautiful artistic film, which is what Nosferatu is. Dracula was turned into, or Bram Stoker's novel Dracula was turned into a Broadway stage play, and that Broadway stage play led to many of the conventions used in the film that has become so iconic. Dracula's collar, for instance, was a stage device that would ultimately hide the fact that the actor who was on stage would disappear and when he turned into a vampire by traveling down a stage trapdoor. That the costume was made in such a way with the standing collar so that it could stand upright even when the actor disappeared. So it would give the impression of basically a disappearance. And that collar and Dracula's outfit, his cape, has become very iconic when we think about Dracula. But do expect, if you're familiar with the novel, that it's going to collapse the plot and the characters. Bela Lugosi, who basically created the role of Dracula, the one that we think of, reputedly learned the role phonetically, that he was not fluent in English. It's one of the reasons for the long, halted, stilted language that he engages in. And I'm hoping I'm not giving away too many spoilers with Dracula, because my suspicion is that you probably have a general understanding of the story. But do look for a few things such as lots of Christian imagery. These films are very Christian centric and are very Eurocentric, as we will find when we move into American horror film. The film code at the time was that the monster needed to be destroyed at the end. Keep that in mind with the ending of Dracula and the what will seem to be a rushed ending. I'm pretty sure that you will respond that way. There would be these large, majestic Gothic sets to reinforce the idea of the Gothic tradition. And Browning liked armadillos, and I guess since it was his film, he could do whatever he wanted. So yes, you're going to see an armadillo in there, and there is no real reason for outside of the fact that, well, Browning liked armadillos. One of the things that I'm going to ask you to pay attention to in terms of Dracula's outfit is the medallion that he is sometimes seen wearing, and it has sometimes been likened to the Star of David. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the idea of some of the symbolism associated with Dracula. Obviously, we have the common horror motif of victim and victimizer, but in addition to that, I wanted to talk about the way that vampire as a whole could be seen from a symbolic perspective, as well as issues of evil foreigner, and blood-sucking capitalists, the sexuality and sensuality of Dracula as penetrator, the corruption of female, the idea that the past will always invade the present, something that we saw in Caligari as well. The contrast between science and religion, you'll see that in the Van Helsing character, that he's able to embrace both, and a sense of the animalistic, which we see within Dracula as well. So you can see this in the sixth section, where I've listed just some of the symbolism. This is what I'm going to be talking about in greater depth after you've watched the film. But I'm cognizant of the time and the fact that you still have to watch Dracula, which is about an hour and 15 minutes or so. So, again, your attendance question for a Saturday the 30th, though if you need additional time, please let me know. Do you agree or disagree after watching Dracula that it is culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant? That's the 1931 film version, that is. And why? So, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and enjoy Dracula as we begin to move into October. And this is very deliberate because I wanted us to have, of course, our Halloween as we are talking about these films. Take care. Bye-bye.